The amendment.
Amendment number 15, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mr. Yakym of Indiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakym, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment is a simple one. It would require that the President's inflation analysis include not just a top-line estimate, but also a breakdown to the CPI's 3 major subgroups: food, energy, and all items less food and energy. Americans are navigating inflation rates not seen in generations, and their dollar isn't going far enough because wages aren't keeping up. It's no wonder that a recent Gallup poll found that 50% of Americans say they are worse off financially than just a year ago. And that's a level not seen since the Great Recession. Let me be clear. We have this generational inflation thanks to 2 years of runaway spending. I'll grant that the pandemic caused massive disruptions to our economy, supply chains, and our way of life. It was going to be a bumpy ride coming out of that. However, policies like the American Rescue Plan that were ran through Congress without a single Republican vote threw gasoline on the fire and supercharged inflation. With one hand, the government was giving away money, and with the other hand, they were taking it right back, and then some, due to inflation. And yet, Americans have essentially been told not to believe their lying eyes. They were assured that inflation would merely be, quote-unquote, transitory, even as it spiraled higher. They were told it was all Vladimir Putin's fault, even though energy inflation averaged just over 21% in 2021, the year before Russia invaded Ukraine. Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, yet again without a single Republican vote. The only problem with the Inflation Reduction Act is that it doesn't actually reduce inflation. Everyday Americans experience inflation has made one thing abundantly clear. Not all inflation is created equal. Energy and food inflation are particularly harmful. There is no more kitchen table issue than food inflation. There is no more readily available reminder of the toll of inflation than the price at the pump. Energy and food inflation impact every single American and hit those living paycheck to paycheck especially hard. Seniors and others on fixed incomes have watched helplessly as costs have risen beyond their ability to keep up. My amendment will ensure that the President keeps food and energy costs front and center before signing an executive order by breaking out inflation analysis down to CPI's 3 main subgroups: food, energy, and all items less food and energy. An overall inflation figure is not enough. Last month's inflation reading showed a 6.4% year-over-year rise in top-line inflation. But let's drill down one level deeper. Food inflation was 10.1%, and energy inflation was 8.7%. This has been the story for the last 2 years. Energy inflation has outpaced overall inflation for 24 of the last 24 months, and food inflation has outpaced overall inflation for 13. The top-line number simply doesn't tell the entire story. Drilling down one level deeper in inflation analysis will increase transparency for the American people. It will focus attention not just on inflation, but on the type of inflation. If the President wants to sign an executive order that, for example, bans new energy production, the American people deserve to know how that order will impact energy inflation. I urge my colleagues to support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
I'm rising to claim time in opposition to the amendment, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman is recognized.
And thank you kindly. I thank the gentleman for introducing his amendment, which would add yet another reporting dimension to this already wasteful bureaucratic paperwork exercise, when what the American people need and deserve and are getting from the Biden administration is real, tangible action to bring down prices in America. What are we doing? Well, here's one of the things we're doing for older people who disproportionately depend on prescription drugs and people battling illness right now. We've dramatically lowered the cost of prescription drugs in the Medicare program for millions and millions of Americans. We just heard someone on the other side of the aisle, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, call this price fixing. Well, here's an example of the price fixing that President Biden and the Democratic majority are engaged in. We fixed the price for people who are paying thousands of dollars for insulin shots. We fixed it by putting it down to $35 a month, and they oppose it. Talk about inflation. What about inflation for diabetics? They don't count. We're not interested in inflation for diabetics, just for large corporations, the people who got more than $1 trillion in a tax cut from the last president. That's what we care about. We don't care about millions of people who have diabetes in the country. We're spending thousands of dollars a year to pay for their insulin shots. Well, we cut that inflation down to $35 a month. And we get a lecture from them about how that doesn't count. The Biden administration is trying to cut hundreds of millions of dollars from people who have to pay under a staggering student loan debt today. And they're fighting us on that. They don't care about that kind of inflation. They don't care about the pocketbooks of people who are staggering under student loan debt. 43 million people. We're talking about billions of dollars. 43 million people will be assisted by the student loan debt executive order and initiatives taken by the Biden administration. But that doesn't count for them. You know, we started this series of amendments by talking about the fact that they have this self-imposed political speech impediment. They can't correctly pronounce the name of our party in its adjectival form. But you know, I thought of a solution to this because I was reading a great book by H.W. Brand about Franklin D. Roosevelt called Traitor to His Class. And in the book, he's got a bunch of Roosevelt's speeches. And you know what President Roosevelt called our party? Not the Democratic Party, much less the Democrat Party. If you can't pronounce it, do what Roosevelt did. He called us the democracy. The democracy. He said, the economic royalists, the corporate plutocrats, say you invest in the wealthiest people in society, some of the wealth will trickle down on everybody else. But the democracy says you invest in the great working middle class of America, we will all rise and prosper together. That's the doctrine of the democracy. If you can't pronounce the name of our party, just call us the democracy. That's what we are today, because we defend the right to vote, and we defend free and fair elections, and we stand by the results of elections. And we defend not only the country and our democratic allies all over the world, as in Ukraine, we defend this body. We defend this chamber. We defend the capital of the United States. And we defend the interests of the working majority of Americans. So the American people are not asking for more reports and more bureaucracy. They're asking for action. And that's what the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress are giving them. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment. Perhaps no part of Biden inflation has been more painful than its impacts on food and energy prices. One can hardly imagine kitchen table issues greater than those. Biden inflation is causing food prices to skyrocket, as well as the prices for energy to cook it, and the prices of gasoline needed to get to the market. And the list goes painfully on. My colleague's amendment makes sure that when the President is considering major executive orders, he will be informed in a crystal clear way of the inflationary impacts his orders may have on food and energy prices. It's my hope that will bring some relief to our constituents at their kitchen tables. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Biden administration brought Trump's unemployment rate, which was skyrocketing, down. We went from 14.8% to less than 4%, creating 12 million new jobs. And now President Biden is bringing down the soaring inflation rate he inherited because of the massive disruption in global supply chains caused by the lethal recklessness of the Trump administration in mismanaging the pandemic response. So we're saying let's finish the job. Just as we brought unemployment down, we're bringing inflation down. We are making the American economy work for the American people through strategic investments like the Infrastructure Act, a $1.2 trillion investment in the roads and the highways and the bridges, the ports, the airports, broadband across the country in the rural areas. President Biden is fighting for investment in the American people. And that's what the Democrats are fighting for, not a bunch of reports. We don't need this legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support, and I yield back the balance of my time.